Right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me. We talked about borders a lot, and I think it's a topic that found itself at the forefront of academic and political discussion, I guess mainly due to the rocket immigration rates in the past few decades. So it's a very popular topic. So borders can be thought of as lines, either man-made or tangible, and tangible or ritually ingrained, like those drawn by our imaginations across seas. In fact, their fictive or hypothetical nature. In fact, their fictive or hypothetical nature is irrelevant. Because a debate over their unreality is irrelevant, because as Foucault reminds us, the imaginary is not a mode of unreality, but indeed a mode of actuality. So this actuality in this case is maintained by paramilitary surveillance and law enforcement at the maritime border zone. Sea borders transform into places of becoming, that is, spaces that are no longer empty lines, but platforms for the representation of territory and sovereignty, claimed and protected by contradictory civilizations. A representation of borders as such, however, cannot suffice for the complex human relations and real situations that characterize the politically charged countries at the margins of the European continent. So there's no doubt that immigration is a hot political issue these days in Europe today. A so-called migration or refugee crisis, as it appeared in big, bold letters in every media platform, became a motto for modern politics, normalized and injected into all segments of social life. Horror stories of migrant shipwrecks became routine, and crisis became an instrument of rule and a technology of power. Its invisible hand granted people the legitimization of certain political and economic decisions, while at the same time it deprived other individuals of any possibility of decision. The territorialized waters of the Aegean turned into anomic spaces that saw border performance being carried out as a process of exclusion through border enforcement and humanitarian rescue operations, both hailed as emergency responses to the crisis. Maurice still gives us this oxymorous term, humanitarian fleet, to describe the paradox of entangled military humanitarian assemblages of European border control. This exceptional assemblage sees the employment of exceptional measures used to deal with the crisis. Agamben's state of exception stretches beyond the barbed wire of an entrenched camp into the sea, transforming it into a state where the bipolitical relationship between citizens and state is at stake. Greece, a peripheral country, finds itself at the center of Europe's unsolved political problem, this time emerging as a kind of proxy for the challenge and failures of the EU in safeguarding the rights of asylum seekers. Greece becomes a strategic node where the national and supranational governance and movement establishes asymmetrical political and economic geographies and dichotomies between the West and its troubled others. And as Heliotis also arguably points out, few, if any, countries in Europe have concerned themselves with immigration and have found themselves at the epicenter of pertinent international attention as much as Greece. Yet contesting the popular headline, I argue that Greece is not the sick man of Europe. Europe is the sick man, and Greece is one of its symptoms, since the problems of the former are currently concentrated there. So in the past 2 years, around 500,000 refugees made their way to Greece, and thousands of others have lost their lives trying to do so. The bio and thanatopolitics of the refugee crisis are symptoms conformable to the problematic concept of fortress Europe, characterized by the increased control of its external borders, but also contrasting to the idea of a borderless Europe that professes globalization and the free internal movement of EU citizens. However, we should not settle with a dual perception of the EU border as external and internal. Instead, we should try to understand that the de- and reconstruction of borders does not occur independently of actors, but it is rather an interconnected process of continuous fluctuation. The collective narrative of my informants at the camps unravels the social relations of power among refugees, traffickers, and governments, and explicitly demonstrates how these relations are not imposed and maintained through physical, but rather through political and economic violence. rescuing them from drowning becomes the lowest form of recognition of their lives. Even as subjects of compassion and sometimes empathy, their bodies don't cease to be manageable. Refugees are identified as physical phenomena flowing and flooding countries. Their bodies transform into states of exception over which they have no sovereignty. By crossing country borders, they simultaneously cross borders of normality and enter voids of law, situated within trajectories of multi-scalar power. A hydraulic approach is adopted to deal with the crisis. So the human streams are being channeled into necessary tanks, valves are tightened, and mobility is restrained and controlled because too much of it causes uncertainty and fear. The identities of this leads to a process of transition, but it's an ongoing process which makes the term transition itself redundant. So the identities of the displaced are being bureaucratically formed and transformed in a necessary process of categorization and prioritization. Their bodies now acquire a double temporality, for they not only constitute inscriptions of power through their political subjectivity, but also inscriptions of a truth expected to be unveiled in a slow and efficient asylum-seeking process. Departing from refugee and detention camps as the readily defined states of exception, I think we ought to acknowledge the multiplicity of the state of exception and its diverse existence within and outside these camps that are not outside and opposites of the polis, the city, but rather the very idioms that produce its neoliberal model. So humanitarian aid at the camps was provided by various local and international NGOs and formed the intersection of the political order and bare life, which were revealed to be the two sides of contemporary democracy. Humanitarians respond to vulnerable individuals, but the process of defining vulnerability, it's on the ground a quintessentially bureaucratic procedure, which systematically recreates power asymmetries. Hospitality, a term coined by Derrida, signifies the impossible coexistence of a necessary exclusionary sovereignty and an absolute openness to the other. In other words, hospitality ensures the hegemony of the host through the incapability of the recipient to reciprocate, thus keeping the latter in abeyance. The distinction between refugees and migrants, worthy and unworthy guests, entangled in the biopolitical project of humanitarianism, this shows that forming concrete identities and categorizations automatically traces borders. Consequently, performing the border means performing the identity. And considering the word performance as one that signifies movement, we come to understand the border as a site of perpetual mobility, a structure that can never be mobile or rigid. Borders are formed, performed, and transformed as means of strategic collaboration or as a coping mechanism by agents on either side. The stable ontological distribution of power and capital is challenged when the borders are crossed in a literal sense, but in the landscape of refugeedom, as was coined by Feldman in 2008, borders are also being crossed in a figurative sense. This happens through a number of bordering and debordering techniques that transform the state of exception into a potential canvas for the enactment of placemaking practices that resisted and rejected the border performance of the saddle power plays of hegemonic hospitality and humanitarian governmentality. And this happened not only by voicing, the refugees did that not only by voicing their demands, but also through a number of other visibility practices that created an organized space of action. In camps, the use of material culture, everyday rituals and cultural etiquette became ways of producing a camp sociality through which border performance emerged as a practice of inclusion, turning the port into an identity and a political space. Border crossing and border resistance appeared not as processes aiming to raise borders, but rather refute and reform their current substance. And to exemplify, I focused on the hijab of Muslim women as a barrier and as a simple use to determine their subjectivity in the context of the crisis. So in the media, political and everyday rhetoric, Muslim women appear to be either the wanted guests in need of saving, savior, or the scarf-wearing symbols of threat and enforcement, the Trojan horse of Islam. I argue that emic understandings of the veil seem to point out to its use as a barrier that does not intend to separate, accentuate, or impose cultural beliefs, but it's rather an enabling factor that protects women's identity and facilitates their agency, rather than inhibiting it in the new structures they find themselves. Can't synchronize with the slides, but... Then, with the evacuation of the port and the transfer of my informants from Piraeus, the port, to Skaramangas, my research scopes expanded beyond the refugees to the counter-public of the Solidarians, which are heavily politicized actors implicated in humanitarian assistance whom I first came in contact with at Piraeus. Being typically members of the radical left, their historical and political legacy is one of dissidence, persecution, and political marginalization, and can be traced in the Athenian neighborhood of Exarchia, an urban hub par excellence of radical social and political movements in Greece. Solidarian, which is alilengios in Greek, can be best translated not as a subject who exhibits solidarity towards those in need, but rather as a subject of solidarity, that is, the person whose political subjectivity is being formed through ideas and feelings of solidarity towards other beings on the basis of sharing a common political status. Solidarian involvement at the port was characterized by an active attempt by the Solidarians to mobilize refugees, distributing a number of texts, either in English, sometimes in Arabic, and that's an example of one of those texts that urges refugees to organize and coordinate their fight in opening the borders. And always written in the first person plural. So like, we should fight together to open the borders. So I noticed the spatio-temporal dimensions of my research field in the ways in which Solidarians at the port consciously and systematically attempted to transform the port to a kind of counter-site that would eventually destabilize the series of strict dichotomies that are constructed on the basis of the distinction between zoe and vios. When I started my research in Exarchia, I had a very firm idea of where its boundaries lie. So I placed a virtual mark on Solonos Street and on Alexandros Avenue, and when surpassing those, I just thought of myself as entering Exarchia. I saw policemen guarding those virtual borders at certain locations. For instance, some of you might know Kolonaki, which is considered more like, expensive neighborhood. Bourgeois, let's say, in Athens. And the fact that they were guarding those virtual borders sort of reinforcement, but at the same time, I soon realized that those territorial boundaries forming the neighborhood, as any neighborhood actually, do not really exist, even if policemen are standing there, and even if certain roads or buildings are arbitrarily used to mark them. So what the unreality of boundaries demonstrates is porous ideologies that are nearly as many as the people I've interviewed, and which create contact zones full of translations and mistranslations, productive and unproductive misunderstandings. So these ideologies that claim to detest borders are actually can be found within borderlands that are off limits. So Exarchia is considered a kind of off limits place, avato in Greek. You can't get in it. Policemen cannot get in it. I think mainly down to fear of creating clashes with the activists and the anarchists there. A couple of my informants reminded me that I should not think of Exarchia as a single space. Indeed, Exarchia consists of multiple social spaces that are and sites of exception that exemplify border performativity on an everyday life level. Informal economies and popular squats in Exarchia emerge as inherited organizational characteristics of urban struggle that shape the historical and political identity of the so-called anti-constitutionals, also referred to as the anti-establishment movement. So solidarity in Exarchia appears as a kind of native notion exhibited through various refugee or not squads, time banks, social groceries, soup kitchens, local assemblies, and other social spaces. So in a way we can say that Exarchia, even prior to the so-called refugee crisis, possessed the social structures necessary, that kind of solidarity economy that prepared it for the crisis. And some people say that anarchists, solidarians within this space did a better job than the government in assisting refugees. Of course, since identifying the Solidarian, the identity of the Solidarian cannot be formed is not formed within the content beyond and inside those borders. But if we are to remember the words of Frederick Barth, we can see that identities are being produced on the very edges of territorialized social spaces, so on the boundaries themselves. And if the boundaries are not rigid, they're mobile and flexible, so are identities. And even though I've spoken about the identity of the refugee, the identity of the migrant, the identity of the Solidarian, I am well aware that these are not concrete identities. And actually my interlocutors rarely self-identified as anything. They refuse to, some of them. So in reality, Solidarians themselves do not descend from a uniform, intransigent social group, but rather a diverse socio-political landscape. The plurality of spaces and ideologies that are produced within Exarchia cancel out each other in a process of creative self-negation and self-transformation, which now sort of makes me understand why one of my informants early in my research told me, Maria, I'm going to tell you something that's going to shock you. Exarchia do not really exist. So, similar to land and sea, the monopolization of separate inner city territories inevitably becomes a process of irreversible historical forcing. Border performance, crossing, and resistance surface as interdependent processes not only on a geopolitical level but also in the micropolitics of everyday life, in the way culture was preserved by refugees at the port, in the veil of Muslim women on Athenian public transport, the diverse and contesting dialectic of social spaces in Exarchia, and whether virtual or tangible borders are being performed everywhere. We cannot do away with them, and even if resisting them reinforces their actuality, that should not deter us from questioning or challenging them. For doing so, I think remains vital to the human condition.